firmly behind former President Trump if he decides to run for the White House in 2024. That support rolled in at the Student Action Summit hosted by conservative nonprofit Turning Point USA. 2 weeks ago, a New York Times Siena College poll of Republicans found half of GOP voters were ready to leave Trump behind and find a new direction in the next election. Today, the country may get its clearest indication yet of just what course 45 is charting for himself as he returns to Washington for the first time since leaving the presidency. We're looking at this step from both sides of the aisle with our political analyst, Democrat Ed Emerson, and Republican Tim Rosales. Gentlemen, good morning to you.
Good morning.
Donald Trump is coming back to Washington to close out the America First Agenda Summit hosted by the America First Policy Institute, or AFPI. That's an advocacy group that bills itself as nonpartisan but is led across the board by former members of the Trump administration. Tim, what about returning to Washington this way, and what about the nonpartisan lingo?
Well, it's certainly a safe and friendly audience for the former president. So, no surprise there. And there are these, types of groups on both sides. So I think that it makes a lot of sense for him to appear with this group. But I've said before, I'm no Trump fan necessarily, but I do think that right now, as it sits today, you've got Donald Trump running against Joe Biden. If that were the case, I think Trump would take him on a second run. But neither of them, I think, really are particularly well positioned to lead this country moving forward. So hopefully we'll get some fresh blood on both sides.
All righty, Ed, what's your thought about what Tim just had to say?
Well, the key for Donald Trump is he going to talk about Russian interference in the election, or paying off hookers, or ransoming the Ukraine? What's he going to say today that will expand his base? He has a definitive, small, ever shrinking number of people who support him. I mean, Biden beat him once, we'll beat him again. I think Donald Trump in handcuffs behind bars is going to have a tough time running for office. I think he'll be indicted either in Georgia first or by the Department of Justice. I think if you look back through his record as president of the United States, potential 20 or 30 count indictments with criminal penalties and prison time on each of those, it's time to say goodbye to this buffoon and start again in the Republican Party.
All righty, Ed, well, tell us how you really feel. Today, Trump is supposed to be, quote, laying out the policy agenda for 2022 and beyond. Now, that's a quote. Is that for the AFPI? Is that for the entire Republican Party? Is it saying that he is still the leader of the Republican Party in this country, and anybody with any other ideas better get out of the way? Just yesterday, former Vice President Pence said at the Young America Foundation that elections, quote, are about the future, and warned against, quote, temptation to look back. Ed.
Yeah, Vice President Pence, Mitt Romney, there are dozens of people that represent conservative values and that represent the Republican Party. Donald Trump is not one of those people. He's morally corrupt, and he needs to go away. I think that Pence can take him on. I think DeSantis is talking about taking him on. I think there are any number of other folks that are willing to pay that price. Donald Trump's remarks today are going to be 30 seconds of policy and then the usual grievance list. Who's after me? Who was unfair to me? Who's going to, somebody's treating me badly. And these indictments are baloney, and we're not going to get anything. There's no policy substance to Donald Trump whatsoever.
So, Tim, former President Trump is going to be laying out whatever this vision for the future is in about 30 minutes on the other coast. So who is this agenda for? Is it for the entire Republican Party? Is that what you're expecting to hear?
Well, to be honest, if I could predict what's going on in former President Trump's head at any point in time, over the last 6 years, I would be in a different position than I am right now, because I would be the only one in the United States or maybe the world who could figure that out. To be honest with you, I'm not sure who the intended target is. I think he's looking at potentially running in the future. But I got to be honest. I can't disagree with the word that Ed just said. And I think he's absolutely right. And I think, thinking about the Republican Party as a institution and also as a thought leader moving forward, I think it's more about some of the people that Ed talked about and others. And looking back at kind of the guy who's sitting behind me, Ronald Reagan and
Right.
some of these others, rather than it is looking at Donald Trump. And I think the same can be said for the Democratic Party. I think right now you've got Joe Biden, whose approval numbers are lower than Trump, Obama. And both Trump and Obama at this point in time in their presidency. I don't think he's doing any favors for the Democratic Party either. I think both parties, to be honest, with the current leadership that they have now in terms of what President Trump's doing, and then also Joe Biden, President Biden in the White House, I think they're both desperately looking for who can lead these parties into the future. There are candidates; they've got a bench, but those people need to step up, and I think the party faithful need to embrace those folks.
Okay, gentlemen, we're starting to run short on time, so I'm going to ask you about last Thursday night and the last of its scheduled public hearings. The country heard a very detailed accounting from Republican appointees and aides that former President Trump wasn't trying to reach out to the Department of Defense or Capitol Police on January 6, 2021, that instead he was struggling with his own Secret Service detail trying to get down to the Capitol where the insurrectionists were breaching the building. So if people are still looking to him for the agenda for the AFPI or for the party, does that mean that this just did not resonate at all, that nobody who wasn't going to listen to this information to begin with, opened an ear and listened, or how is it that people are still looking to him to be setting any agenda at all? And again, we're short on time, so Tim, you first.
I'll tell you, I think Vice President Pence is an honorable guy. I've worked with the Secret Service, as Ed has, throughout our careers, and I would trust those guys 110, 150%, any day of the week. So, I honestly don't know. But that's kind of where my thoughts are in terms of what's been said so far at the hearings.
So don't know if anybody who wasn't listening, don't have a sense if anybody who wasn't listening before about the accountings from all of these folks has turned it all and changed it all and is listening now. Ed, what do you have to say about that?
I would support a Cheney Kinzinger ticket at this point. I would take the two of them over just about anybody in the Republican Party. She's in trouble in Wyoming, and it's unfortunate. I don't think she's going to get out of the primary. Adam Kinzinger has already said he's not going to run. It's time to move on from a morally bankrupt, directionless, policy-free, non-intellectual. I could go on, but I'm not gonna.
Okay, remember, we are short on time.
Republican Party has a lot of values that are important to this country, and that's what they need to represent.
All righty, and we will see what former President Trump has to say in about 30 minutes as he starts speaking in Washington, D.C. on his return. Thank you so much for digging into the issue with us this morning.
Thank you, Ray.